All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our 10 o'clock session with Dr. Jensen. He's going to be speaking to us about stress and adaptation, the historical and future perspectives. I am Emily Sauers. I am an associate professor at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, and I'm going to be serving as moderator. So we will let Dr. Jensen speak and give us his presentation, and then we should have time at the end, roughly 5-10 minutes or so, for questions from the audience. Okay? So a little bit about Dr. Jensen. He is currently an associate professor of health and exercise science at the University of the Pacific. He teaches courses that are, that emphasize stress physiology, muscle physiology, and clinical epidemiology. He's very active with ACSM, and between the years of 2017 2022, he co-authored 115 abstracts for ACSM. So that's very, very impressive, I think it's fair to say, and very involved with ACSM. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Jensen.
Thank you. All right, so that is my title up there, and that is a very old picture of me thinking about that title, which gives an indication of how long I have been working with this subject and how long I've been thinking about progress in this field. There's a number of different settings, different environments that we would consider stressors on the human body. And the list goes on and on. Go hike Everest, go swim in a cold ocean, hang on to a fever for too long. Any of these marks a perturbance to our homeostasis. And if that disturbance gets a little bit extreme, life changes in a hurry, potentially death arrives relatively fast. Let's just go through very briefly a couple of these contexts. Heat is one of them. I come from the Central Valley, California, right in the center. It's pretty hot. It got into the 90s in February, and the last day in the 90s was 2 weeks ago. It cleared 115 degrees several times this year, but it's not as hot as Death Valley, which is just to the southeast of where I am. And in 2021, it hit 130 degrees. The year before, it was 129.9. This year was a little bit cooler at 127. But that's not the hottest place in the world. There are places in Australia, places in Iran, where we're seeing a higher heat. And life that lives there or endures that heat is put at constant risk. Opposite that, cold, this is a city in a town, more than a city, in northeastern Russia that reached negative 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And uninhabited places have been marked much colder year after year. And we've been looking at this stuff for a long time. This is an article from 1958 where we're getting excited about climate extremes and life that might live there. Now, we could go down the rabbit hole on any one of these topics, pick any stressor on that list, and we could spend the rest of this presentation plumbing the rabbit catacombs, and to no satisfaction because there would be no completion to the topic. When I teach, I spend most of my time in the weeds, but I have a whole semester to do it. And so for today's presentation, I think it's best to stay sort of at the ground level, the fundamentals, and the foundation of all of this really is fitness. It took me 3 airports to get here. There was the departing airport, the layover, and then the arriving airport. And I'm sure most people have passed through airports, some of you at least have passed through airports, and this seems to be the last refuge of the magazine industry. Just walk through that airport and stall after stall, there's rows of magazines. And walking by these, you would be forgiven for thinking the definition of fitness is ripped abs, or I don't know, Chris Pratt is jumping, or whatever. That fitness has something to do with athletic performance or physique or something. And those are components, but really, fitness is just the appropriateness of the biology, the appropriateness of the form to the environment in which it inhabits. So the suitability or the compatibility with the profile of stressors, of threats. Now, if we were just simply tardigrades, any of these little critters right here, on Monday, they could go kite sailing above Everest, right? On Tuesday, they're spelunking in the Mariana Trench, right? And then Wednesday, they feel great, but that's not us. All of these things, they threaten us, and so we need to adapt to them to ensure our survival. So we can at least survive, if not thrive, in those diverse environments. And so biology's purpose is, especially considering us, is just preservation of the host, self-preservation, so that we can live long enough to fling our genomes into the future. And this is not a new concept, right? This idea of self-preservation, here's Andrew Marvell in December of 1675, and the opening lines are, "Self-preservation, nature's first great law." So this isn't a novel assumption or novel work. It took 300 years, almost to the day. It was January of 1976. So almost 300 years to the day later, Richard Dawkins begins to discuss replication of the gene as something closer to nature's first great law. There's no way Andrew Marvell could have known that at the time. But get into the 1930s, and a figure emerges that everybody knows. If you're old enough to know when Halloween was, you know who Hans Selye is. He's a world-renowned figure. He was the son of a physician who was in turn the son of a physician, and both dad and granddad used bloodletting on their patients. So if you look through Selye's historical record, you see a lot of sympathetic commentary on the practice, on bloodletting. But he was a smart guy. He had 3 doctorates, more than 30 books. Depends what you count as a book, like pamphlets and whatever. He had more than 1,000 articles. He was nominated for 17 Nobel Prizes and won 0. But he was given 3 stamps as a consolation prize for his lack of Nobel work. Now, in the 1930s, he started studying rats. And he was injected, what he was looking for was a new sex hormone, hoping to discover a new sex hormone. So he took a bunch of rats, and he was injecting them with ovarian and placental extracts. Good place to look if you're looking for new sex hormones. And what he found were these signature responses. You can't just ask the rats, how do you feel? You know, they lack the power of language. And so you can't ask the rats psychological or emotional questions and get a response. You just have to look for the path of what's happening in the biology. And what he was finding was enlargement of the adrenal glands, the shrinking of the thymus, and stomach ulcers. And he gets really giddy, he gets really excited. I discovered a new stress hormone. And he's smart enough to test that, to inject them with some other stuff, extracts of whatever. And in those additional injections, all of the same results, the exact same profile of symptoms emerged. And he added a couple more: depletion of eosinophils, reduction of body weight, to this profile of generalities that he was looking at. And so he publishes this. It was a 1 page, it goes over into the 2nd page, but it's shorter than 1 page if you export it. This letter to the editor in Nature called "A Syndrome Produced by Diverse Noxious Agents." And this, July 4th, 1936, a very patriotic publication, is where he put forward that gas, that general adaptation premise. And this is the last paragraph. This is what begins, Macaulay Culkin isn't in it, but this is what begins the last paragraph of his paper, of his letter. And it says, "We consider the first stage to be the expression of a general alarm of the organism." And this is true. We see this today. It's foundational, it's basic, but it's true. The sympatho-adrenal medullary response, right? Let's get some epinephrine going. the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? Let's get some cortisol going. So we have an amine hormone on one side, we have a steroid hormone on the other side, both of them aimed at getting energy substrates on the march. Now, he didn't know the state of evidence that we have today that this fight or flight response, what he would call the general alarm reaction, he didn't know that it involves more than that. And so even our bones play in, right? We have osteocalcin that's going to be released. And so the bones act as an endocrine organ to help suppress the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot more to it. But Selye went on to get a little bit weird in what he was saying and defend that weirdness. Again, brilliant guy, but in the end, he talks about general adaptation syndrome. So there's an acute response and a chronic response, and he puts generality on both of these. And in the article, he talks about cold, surgical injury, exercise, extreme exercise, various drugs, and to all of these, he says this typical typical presentation, a typical syndrome appears. Now, I took this picture of the stress of life a couple of weeks ago. Michael Bruno, the president of the regional chapter, mailed it to me. It came in the mail one day. And so I read it a few weeks ago. I'd read all of his articles, but I'd never actually read the book. So I read it a couple weeks ago. And he gets, again, a little bit weird. And so I'm going to walk you through some of these passages with Selye, and then we'll move into some more historical figures, and then we'll end with some future stuff, my contributions to the field, things like that. So at the beginning, this is page 4. The corresponding page number is going to be somewhere on the slide, somewhere in that little space. But that's the exact book Bruno sent me. And he begins by asking, what is stress? He doesn't quite answer it for a while, but he presents a number of situations, a number of populations, which is a beggar, a mother, a shopkeep, a soldier, a jockey, the horse itself. He just presents all of these different populations and then goes on to say there's a similarity between all of them. There's commonality between all of these different populations. And on page 13 here, the laser pointer isn't working, so just pretend that it is. He asks if there is a non-specific disease, a defense system, and a unified theory of disease. So a non-specific defense system and a unified theory of disease. And then he questions the wisdom of medicine, saying that it might not be so wise to treat the individual disease, to treat the isolated symptoms, to consider targeted therapies. Maybe what we should be looking at is, quote, the syndrome of just being sick, and then this last line here, he says, which is apparently superimposed upon all individual diseases. There are 2 exclamation points. One was insufficient to exclaim at the volume he intended. So we should be, according to Selye, looking at general illness as opposed to targeted treatments. He goes on to define what GAS is, general adaptation syndrome, parsing it out into the separate words. It's exactly what you would, if you were to just imagine what he said, that's exactly what he said. And then we still don't have a definition of what stress is at this point. So he provides one. We're on pages 53 and 54, and he lists 9 things, 9 different things, which a careful reading would show you is essentially everything in the universe. Name a thing, any variable, a measurable thing, and it meets his criteria for exclusion. And so it leaves us wondering a little bit, what actually is stress? The crack beneath that door, I mean, he just barricades the definition, and the crack beneath that door is so narrow, one wonders what can escape, what can get through there. And then he tells you it is literally wind gets through that crack beneath the door. He's getting a little bit whimsical here, but he's quoting Robert Louis Stevenson. "Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by." And so he gets a little bit whimsical at the onset of saying, what actually is stress? And stress leaves a trail. There's a wake in the path of stress that he's talking about. And it's not the bowing of trees. He is suggesting that it is the enlargement of the adrenal glands, the shrinking of the thymus, stuff like that. But he goes on to assign a little bit more importance to this and talks about the body as, about aging, about stress as the speedometer of life, quote, the speedometer of life, and quote, the rate of wear and tear on the body. So he's presenting a model of chronobiology that's similar to Dorian Gray, if you're familiar with Oscar Wilde, the aging painting minus the painting. But in the book, stress, all of this puts wrinkles on our face in Dorian Gray. It ages the tissues, it makes our joints cranky, right? So that's the premise that Selye is putting forward, is that biological aging is not about aging, it's about the accumulation of stress. And if that passage right there isn't enough, on 276 he says, "Among all my autopsies, and I have performed quite a few, I have never seen a man who died of old age. In fact, I do not think anyone has ever died of old age yet." So he really does get big and bold in his claims that stress is the culprit for all of this stuff, this very gusty stress. And then he closes the book just reiterating the importance of looking at generalities. Now, let's put it into some contemporary context. Here is a list of possible stressors. Some of these are physical, some of these are emotional, psychological, right? The biopsychosocial model includes a lot of variables. And, so up top we have allergies, and then we have altitude and oxygen threats, and then we have heat, and then we have sleep deprivation. Just go down the list. There are so many unique stressors here. And what Selye would say is each of these is essentially a source of aging, of general progress of life's aging cycle. But really what this is a bunch of unique stressors. And like, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, I hadn't started putting together this presentation, and it was starting to stress me out because I'm gonna have to stand up here and talk, and I gotta put this thing together. And then I realized it was arm day. But I'm stressed enough from the presentation, I don't need to work arms. That's not how it works, right? Generalities are fiction in how we respond to this stuff. So like Richard Simmons and me and everyone in the room, we are acutely threatened in a very distinct way by all of these diverse stressors. We're not tardigrades. We can't just cope with it at first blush. Right? We need to adapt to these things, and we adapt in unique ways. Chronically, we adapt in unique ways. Now, the same year that Selye book came out, The Stress of Life, 1956, this article came out. It was submitted in 1954, November 54. It was published in 56. And this is Edward Adolph, and it is a response to the popularity of Selye in the day. This is the second paragraph of his introduction, where he says, "It has been widely supposed that adaptations to various stressors have much in common. I ask how much? The conclusion will be reached that combinations of modifications differ markedly from one stressor to another." Now, if it's not obvious enough that he's commenting on Selye at this point, let's go to the last paragraph of the entire paper. This is his conclusion. This is the final paragraph. I've highlighted in red. He's talking about specificity of adaptation, and he goes on to say, "Although this possibility has been heretofore recognized, it has been neglected by the belief that the general syndrome predominates." So clearly, this is a bit of a dig at Hans Selye. The same year his book comes out, 20 years after that initial paper in Nature. Now, go a few years before this, split the difference from when Selye published his first paper and Edward Adolph is publishing. We have Thomas DeLorme. Thomas DeLorme published a 24-page paper on resistance training in wounded servicemen, so soldiers who have injuries. And a careful reading of this reveals he's writing in a world that Selye was never born. He doesn't acknowledge Selye by name or concept. There's no reading of this in which Selye was ever even encountered or thought about. None of Selye's premises. But what he's doing against wounded servicemen is lower limb injuries, these 10 different injuries, and mostly knees, banged up knees in soldiers. And this is World War II. These are World War II soldiers. And he makes a distinction between endurance and power exercise, where he says power building exercises and endurance exercises. These are two entirely different types, each one producing its own results, and each being wholly incapable of producing the results obtained by the other. A muscle exercise solely on power building exercises will not have the quality of endurance, whereas a muscle subjected exclusively to endurance building exercises will not have the quality of power. How illogical would it be for a trackman, World War II time, for a trackman to train for long distance running events solely by doing knee bends with heavy weights on his shoulder, or a professional weightlifter to train for heavy lifts solely by running several miles a day? Again, the exclamation points. Very prominent in older literature. And so in 1945, we're already seeing specificity of adaptation in a weight room. But Selye wasn't the first person to talk about stress responses. This is Julius Wolff right here. He's a German anatomist. And in 1892, he published his book, The Law of Bone Remodeling. And in it, he talks about mechanobiology, load profiles on bones, and how those bones will remodel their architecture to support the specific nature of that load profile. Now, in the 19th century, we knew nothing about mechanobiology, right? The cell signaling cascades, we knew nothing about this stuff, but the foundation was established and not overturned. But Julius Wolff wasn't the first person to talk about it either, first person to publish about it. I'm sure Socrates talked about it, but the first person to publish about this is Henry Gassett Davis. He was an American surgeon. He published, it was 1867, 25 years earlier, he published the book Conservative Surgery, and he's talking about stretch and you get stretchy, right? It's obvious. With stretching, stresses applied to a tissue, that particular load, there's a lengthening response. And he talks about ligaments, quote, and any other soft tissue. Now today, we're looking at nanostructure differences and explaining a lot of how this works in more complicated terms. But the biology of that foundation has been established, upon which we get a second story, a third story, a fourth story, today's profile of understanding. Now later in Selye's career, this is from 1950, later in Selye's career, he did start to give a little bit of room, widen his berth for specificity, saying, what is at first general does start to become specific. We have these overlaid specific responses upon the generalities. 1955, he's making some similar claims, saying, okay, I will acknowledge that specificity has a little bit of room, but remember the book came out the following year, so he spent the rest of his life defending, almost in a legal way, almost the general adaptation syndrome. Now, let's get out of historical figures and move into a little bit something closer to pop culture ephemera, and then we'll get into today's understanding of specificity of adaptation, how the body responds to stressors. This is Jason Lewis right here, not a scientist. In 1994, he set off to circle the globe and by his own body, right? Pedal your own bike, paddle your own boat, use your feet a lot. And it took him 13 years to make it all the way around the world. And afterward, he published a few books, but this passage is enough to tell us the lesson that we learn from his experience, his 13-year voyage around the planet. I learned one thing very quickly after pedaling away from the Greenwich Meridian line all those years ago. No two environments on the face of this earth are identical. Every swell, every road, every mountain, and every minute spent crossing the same stretch of desert created a new experience for both my mind and my body. Now, he wasn't the first person to say that. In the 5th century BC, Cratylus said it. Pretty much the same thing. It wasn't the exact same context. But this isn't a new concept. This idea that there are no two environments that are the same. However close they appear, no two environments truly are identical. And in that same, just one step further, in that same line of thinking, there are no two adaptations that are identical. Because we are not subjected to two identical environments, each adaptation is unique. And it's not just in people, right? Look to birds. There's a lot of studies on bird song. And where do those birds live? Do they live in the woods? Do they live around water? Do they live in an urban setting? And the evolution of bird song is because of those environments, and you can track it. I'm an hour inland from San Francisco. Go to San Francisco and listen to the development of urban noise and track the birds, and their songs change to be able to compete with that noise. The environment determines the bird's behavior. Now, it's not just humans, it's not just birds, it's not even just living things, that the environment is critical to the development of the form, of the physique. Consider the snowflake, right? We'll call it physique. A snowflake's physique is shaped, it is entirely formed by the path it takes from cloud to ground. The path the snowflake takes, the environments through which it goes, creates its architecture, its structure. Now, this isn't a scientific article here, this is from Forbes. It's just a commentary on the mathematics of snowflake diversity and uniqueness. And that's all we need to know about snowflakes, is they're determined by their environment. Now, the second slide that I had was a list of various stressors, everything from pregnancy to altitude, to microbial stressors, and so just this whole list of stressors. Each one of these is so comprehensive that a single ACSM, where every single speaker is talking about a single topic, wouldn't come close to the depth on that topic. So let's just take one thing. We'll stay a little bit superficial here. We'll take one thing, which is exercise, self-imposed loads upon your tissues. And this is Katy Bowman down here. She's a science writer. I think she's the one who came up with this idea, who coined this idea. If she took it from someone else, then my apologies. Maybe you're the one who came up with it and she used it. But to my understanding, she's the one who came up with this idea, which is the nutritional profile of foods. That food label is how we evaluate the nutrients of food, the macronutrients, the micronutrients. No food is so perfect that when you eat it, there's nothing else that needs to be consumed, right? Whatever case you want to make for kale, fine, right? For chia seeds, whatever it is, there's no superfood that is so super that you don't need a diverse profile of ingestion. And we can do the exact same thing with a nutrient profile for exercise. You know, the type of load, is it dynamic, is it isometric, the magnitude, the amount of weight, the rate of application, the direction. There's sort of macronutrients and micronutrients with a load profile. And just like with food, where you cannot identify a single food that will satisfy all of your body's needs throughout the day, the week, the month, a life, nor can you identify one movement profile, one exercise, one load that's going to do it. You can't just do push-ups and be, oh, I can run the marathon now, right? It's so unique, these load profiles. And if we want to be healthy, we have to diversify our output, I guess it would be. The ingestion and the output both need to be diverse. So getting into some of what we know about the specificity of adaptation, let's start with running. Let's start with you hop on a treadmill, get on the sidewalk, and go for a jog. Beginning in 1970, we've been talking about the specificity of the pace, of how fast are you moving. And if you want to get good at moving fast, you better move fast. Moving slowly, no matter what the load is not helping with a faster pace. There's some evidence, this one talks about it, where moving fast can help you move slowly. It's not as good at it, but it can help you do that. Now fast forward the world a few and a half decades, let's get to 2006, and we're still studying the same thing. We're still coming to a deeper understanding of this. And it really is a weak transfer to other speeds. Now, training slowly does not help you train fast, but it's even a weak transfer if you're training fast to your ability to perform better at a slower velocity. Get into isokinetic, a steady speed, and this illustrates the phenomenon even better. This is also from 2006. It illustrates the phenomenon even better, where the farther from your training velocity, the more those results diminish. They found fast begets fast, slow begets slow. Each of those does best. So if you want to get good at slow stuff, do slow stuff. Fast stuff isn't as good. If you want to get good at fast stuff, slow stuff is almost useless. But doing isokinetics set a speed, and the farther you depart from that speed, the results diminish. In resistance training, we see the exact same thing. In resistance training, it's the same thing for isometric. This is called angular specificity. I could have filled this entire slideshow with articles that comment on this. Here's a list of 9 of them. I should have warned you at the beginning, I go through slides quickly. So if you want to take pictures, be quick on the draw. So angular specificity is the same thing, in which whatever angle you are regularly training, that is the angle you are benefiting from. And if you stretch it out a little bit more, you'll see a few extra degrees in the more contracted state. But for the most part, diminishing returns as you move farther and farther from that angle. Now, lots of explanations. There's sarcomerogenesis, sarcomerolysis. You're gonna get some genesis out here, some lysis up there to try to match that length-tension relationship in the tissue. But there's a lot of explanations. The crude effect is on performance. Now, what's true for skeletal muscle is true for cardiac muscle. We're not gonna go too deeply into this, but I will talk a little bit about heart rate and cardiac performance in some work I've done recently. And so I'll just introduce this idea of reading that article title tells you enough. Endurance exercise-induced cardiac remodeling. Not all sports are created equal. These diagrams are from the bold article up there, and it just shows end diastolic volume over here, left ventricular end diastolic volume, left ventricular mass, and VO2 max. It shows those and divides it sport by sport. So no matter the profile of stressors, you can be sure your cardiovascular system is remodeling itself to better tolerate those particular sport-specific stressors. And this should be obvious to everyone. It didn't need the study, although it was a good one. It's helpful to have this confirmed when we see swimming and running. These are 2 very different activities. Now, it may have a similar metabolic demand, just a crude metabolic demand may be very similar, but if you're upright or if you're prone, those are 2 very different systems on how blood is in circulation, and you can bet those different environments are going to result in different cardiovascular adaptations. Now, what's true for the skeletal muscle, that's true for the heart, is true for the ear, right? It is true for the nose. When we're looking at sensory adaptation, sensitization, we see specificity of sensitization as well. So if you want to be a good sommelier, for example, you have to train that specific thing. You can't just eat candy and tacos, and so now I'm better at wine tasting, right? There's specificity of a sensitivity response to all of those things. And the musician knows this, but it's coming out more and more in the sciences. With COVID literature and olfactory effects, we're looking at the sensitivity of retraining of that scent. Now, to finish up our generalities of stress and adaptation, I'll read a couple of quotations from these corresponding books, and then we'll get more into sport-specific adaptation. So, the very act of not squatting may be as important in terms of creating a biomechanical environment as squatting itself. Again, everything in our environment, whether that is loads or the absence of loads, if it's abundance or dearth, everything in our environment is creating signals for adaptation. And then Calvin Wells down here, this is the heaviest object on the planet. If anyone has this book, Bones, Bodies, and Disease, it weighs like 1,000 pounds and it's not that big. But he says, the pattern of disease or injury that affects any group of people is never a matter of chance. It is invariably the expression of stresses and strains to which they were exposed, a response to everything in their environment and behavior. Maybe it's more appropriate to say stresses and loads, whatever. This is saying that we look for load profiles and environments to facilitate athletic development, enhancements to human performance. But it's the same thing in the other direction. Deterioration is just a matter of environments and loads. And we've all seen the SeaWorld orca, where the folded fin syndrome or flaccid fin syndrome, it's not actually flaccid, but that's just a response to the load profile for the most part. All of these things, whether we're looking at physical therapy applications, let's change a load profile to elicit an outcome, or athletic enhancement, whatever it is a manipulation of the environment. Okay, as our springboard into athletic commentary, does everybody know who Andre Agassi is? He's a bit of an aging sports phenomenon, but he was a phenomenon. And I took from his book Open, pages 137 and 138. He talks about meeting his trainer Gil Reyes. And Gil did a basic task analysis. Let's figure out what your sport entails, and then we can gear your training around that particular sport. So he's 19, Andre Agassi is at the time. He's good, but he's not a known entity. He's not this world-renowned tennis player. And so Gil asks him how much he's running every day, and Agassi says 5 miles. He's a tennis player, and he's jogging 5 miles a day. Gil Reyes asks him why, and he has no idea why he's training in this way. Reyes, have you ever run 5 miles in a match? Agassi, no. How often in a match do you run more than 5 steps in one direction before stopping? Not very. So that's a basic task analysis, right? And after doing this task analysis and creating a training profile that structures stresses according to the performance he needs to do on the court, Agassi got so famous that Nike's made, I was in elementary school when these came out, the Andre Agassi shoes, they were the most desirable physical object in the universe when I was an elementary schooler. I like to think I had them, but I think I'm probably just conflating myself with jealousy of other people's shoes. And so I have the Andre Agassi's providing a little bit of limitation on the task analysis. The last couple of things we'll talk about, which is where I come in. We're not going to talk about historical figures here. The first thing is that not all stresses are biological. Not all stressors can be measured on a heart rate monitor, right? Not all stressors can be measured by some load profile. Some of these, the whole biopsychosocial model, some of these fall into emotional and psychological domains, and that allostatic load, getting dangerously close to Selye, but that summation of stresses does involve other components. And then secondly, the task analysis, what Gil Reyes did here, which is a fundamental, necessary step to get people ready for sport performance, to train people, it's not really considering the athletes themselves. It's considering the sport, it's considering what athletes need to do, but it's not considering the individual. And so if what we're doing is at my university and many other universities, everybody, like let's say you're a female soccer player. Every one of them has the same workout. Maybe the goalie has something else. If you are a water polo player, every one of them has the same workout. If you're a men's or women's basketball player, every one of them has the same workout. That's general adaptation syndrome. That you do a task analysis and then assume every single person is going to benefit from that, not looking at the individual themselves. So, as was mentioned, since 2017, I've co-authored 115 national conference ACSM abstracts, and my students are first authors in all of them. And so I'm the graduate director of the program. I have a lot of graduate students coming through, but I work with grad and undergrad. And the students are first author, my students are first author in all of them. And here's a couple of them. This is from the most recent national conference down in San Diego, which was very close for me, that one. And I'm gonna talk about both of these, but we were looking at the women's soccer team. And there were 30 female soccer players, and they wore the Polar Team Pro devices every single day for 35 consecutive days, and we measured everything they were doing, and during that time, 20 practices and 7 games, 7 competitions. Now the first question to ask is, are these athletes training in a way that would map onto a competition? In timing, no. None of the practices fall at the same time of day I mean, not one of those practices was in the same block. There was no overlap for time of day, and that tends to be pretty common. We're not training when we would be performing. However, from those polar devices, exercise duration, there's a few different kinds of practices. It's a morning or it's an afternoon, it's a single practice for the day. I could lump these together or segregate them into their individual parts, and so I chose to do the latter. But competition, the games are over here on the right in green, and these 3 are all practices. Exercise duration, competition is way longer, okay? Total distance that the athletes are running during the course of a session, competition is much longer. Number of sprints performed within that session, competition is much higher. Now, this doesn't mean significance everywhere, but competition compared to practice for the maximum sprint speed, it's significant against a couple of them. It's significant against the lumped together practices as well. But there is a pattern for a competition, they're running faster. Maximum heart rate achieved, similar. It's not significant at each comparison, but it is the highest maximum heart rate. And then estimated energy, those polar devices calculate a few things that get a little bit, there's a little room for error in some of these, but estimated energy, competition is much higher, as you would expect. They're running farther, this lasts longer, their heart rates are higher. Clearly, we're going to see higher in competition. Now this one, I've tried to figure out how Polar is calculating this. It seems to be a proprietary calculation, but the training load, which involves all of those previous variables I was talking about. In regression models, if you put training load and distance covered, duration, heart rate, all those things, you see multicollinearity, you see variance inflation factors of like 60, these outrageous numbers of tight correlations within the predictors. And so clearly training load is using some of those other predictors, but competition is so much higher than training. Cardio load, same thing. It's calculated differently, but it's the same thing, where you see competition being much higher. Another proprietary calculation of Polar. Here's where it takes a turn for the interesting. We would expect competition to look a little bit different from practice. We would hope that practice has features that resemble competition. Specificity of adaptation, what's the environment like? You're not gonna win the game if you don't train for the game. But when we see recovery duration, now again, proprietary, I couldn't figure out the exact formula. If anybody in the audience knows that formula, when we get to Q&A, I would love to hear it. So correct me, if I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But competition, there was, the data on this one were a little bit weird. Those standard deviations are huge. And so I went through the data and looked for outliers, and some people, there's a couple of zeros in there. You know, maybe they didn't play, I don't know, they were wearing it right or whatever. And there's a couple that just went on for eternity. Maybe they got COVID or something. So I'm not sure what those are. And so what I did was I purged. I went from the 5th to 95th percentile and the 10th to 90th percentile, and those outliers worked their way out. And I retained this, and I ran the exact same regression on both of these. And I did it in, just even Karl Popper, Sir Dr. Karl Popper, where he says, you know, the method of science is bold conjectures and severe attempts to refute them. So I came up with this original model, and then I ran it in about 50 different ways, not to try to find a stronger one. This is the weakest one. This is the weakest model. But to see if I could explain away my finding. Remodel the data, run it in a different way, and see if I could destroy my finding, because if I can, it's not interesting. This is the weakest way. So when you see these unstandardized betas, every other model I ran was stronger. And so I like to begin with that, and I'll be happy to answer questions about this. If you have questions, I have other models in here where you see much higher unstandardized betas. But holding constant training load, if you put in the other variables, those variance inflation factors, again, they're like 60. So training load and day of the season, because we do adapt. If you hold those two things constant, a game associates with about 18 and a half hours of additional recovery time to get heart rate variability, to get back to some baseline. About 18 and a half additional hours of recovery time. Now, do we adapt to these things? Let's look at practices and games differently. Let's look at these in isolation. Again, 5th to 95th percentile, 10th to 90th percentile. Holding training load constant, with each additional practice, we're seeing about a half hour or so of faster recovery. So we are recovering better after serial practices with each successive practice. And we see the same thing in games, the exact same model, but using game numbers, an ordinal variable. There's 2.5, 3 hours of improved recovery, and they are pretty linear. These relationships are pretty linear, that improvement throughout the season. Okay. Moving on to Proteus. I don't know that everybody knows what Proteus is, so let me just take a minute to explain. This is the device up here, and it's a biomechanics. I use it for research. Most sites use it for exercise. It's at a lot of hospitals for rehab. Lots of professional teams use it. I think the Dodgers were the first baseball team to have it, but this is positioned all over the place now. And it has a little handle that you hold, and you can replace that handle with a barbell. You can replace it with a tennis racket handle, a baseball bat handle. You can replace that handle with anything. And what you do is just move it all over the place in three-dimensional space. Do whatever you want with it. You can program a movement pattern, and it will track that movement in three-dimensional space. And it will tell you, you can program what weight you want. It's a magnetic weight system, so it's isotonic, but it's almost like moving underwater, but actually steady. I mean, to the gram, you can measure the resistance profile on this thing. But so it's steady, concentric, isotonic motion, and you go through a set of something, and it will tell you acceleration, it will tell you maximum velocity, it will tell you power, it will tell you deceleration, it will tell you endurance on serial repetitions. If you do 6 repetitions, say, can you replicate the power profile of the first one? It will tell you consistency. How consistent in three-dimensional space are you? Were you a millimeter off here, a millimeter off there? And so that's really what I'm looking at. And I've been senior author, my students are first author, on 22 abstracts using the Proteus so far. And those were smaller questions where I was looking at the use of the mechanical profiles and fastball velocity, something like this, on smaller samples. I did do one last year on age and what the biomechanical capacities are throughout the lifespan. At what ages do we start to dwindle a little bit in some of these capacities? And that was on 10,000 sets performed on this. But this year, I don't work with the company. I collaborate with them, but there's no partnership. I don't own stock. I've never been paid a dime, so there's no financial relationship at all. What I see Proteus as is an opportunity to explore domains of athleticism. The task analysis is limited to the sport. We need to figure out how the athlete relates to that sport. And I think there are domains that are under-measured here. And I think Proteus is an opportunity to do so. And so I've been working with this. So this is 10 sites. My university isn't one of these sites, 10 national sites that I've exported just as a pilot test to look for some larger questions before I export more than 100 sites. So the final analysis I'm going to do will be on more than 1 million repetitions. I'm doing some pilot studies right now, looking to get ideas for the questions so I can test them later with a larger sample. So this one's on over 500 subjects, mostly male, mostly in their 20s, 40,000 sets. And the questions that I'm looking at present and gearing up for the national conference are, do some athletes exhibit imbalances in force and velocity? Now, obviously, yes. I mean, that's the obvious conclusion is yes, there is. All you have to do is look at where the muscles insert. The moment arms are going to be different here. Type 1 versus type 2 tissue profile. I mean, so there's lots of reasons, but training, how we train, is one of those reasons. And what we're seeing in some preliminary work is some athletes need to lighten that load. Some athletes, you can't just keep going heavy all the time. They are not getting the speed, they're not getting the velocity that the sport would call for. And vice versa. Some athletes need to heavy up this load a little bit. We're seeing acceleration being very fast, but the peak power is relatively modest for the amount of acceleration we're seeing. So very preliminary work there. Are there distinct kinematic archetypes characteristic of different skill levels? So I'm getting anonymized data, but I do have skill level. And in the database I've analyzed here, there are numerous professional baseball players, there are high schoolers, there are collegiate athletes. So there's a number of different populations here, and then recreational users as well. And to start to look for kinematic profiles that would be representative of everybody in the pros, moves in this way, has this acceleration, but to look for these things, which haven't, to my knowledge, haven't been explored in a truly sort of falsifiable, effective, isotonic way that would transfer to the sport. Does plyometric capacity differ between athletes? And so by that, I just mean that let's get out of alpha motor nerves and hop on some gammas and see if there's a stretch flex response that is different from one athlete to another. And do some athletes, is their plyometric capacity greater or weaker? And can it be trained? Are there, but core, right, very loosely, core differences in terms of the athlete's potential, in terms of what they've been exercising. So preliminary analyses, what we're finding is that in these particular planes, limb exercises in the sagittal planes. Athletes love it. Athletes love upper and lower limb exercises in the sagittal plane. You get into the transverse plane, and it starts to look a little bit undertrained in many athletes. But in some of those core exercises, we're seeing some deficiencies. Very early looks at this. And then bilateral versus unilateral, right? So some athletes are going to be one side dominant very extremely. Others might have more of a balance. And then unilateral versus bilateral. So a single arm, a single leg versus like a bench press versus a single arm dumbbell press. Something like that. And then sex and age, how those influence. So I'll just, for today, I'm gonna go through a few of these. The plyometrics and the bilateral imbalances, the age one, that was at the last national conference, and I had 10,000 repetitions that I was looking through for that one. So I think I covered that one okay at the conference. But to look at these, I narrowed it down a little bit. it. There are 119 different exercises programmed in here, and there are some boxers in this, and so there's a couple of people who were doing jabs and uppercuts on the machine, stuff like that, but it wasn't done by essentially everybody. And what I want to see is exercises that are performed by a vast number of people so I can make a better comparison. Again, it's mostly men. There aren't as many women in the data. I randomly exported these databases. And so it just happened to be fewer women. On my computer, I have another million repetitions that I could be, another million sets that I could be looking at. The ones I exported just happened to be much more male. So, but the number of sets of each one of these, in particular, when we're looking at trunk rotation, a lot of people do trunk rotation exercises on this. They hold the handle and do some transverse, just a twist, left and right. Now, looking at males and females, I don't think anybody can squint that into focus, but what we're seeing is the percent difference between male and female, and in the triceps extension, single-handed, males are about twice for the power. And then what I mean by mean power is people do 6, 7, 8 repetitions, and this is the peak power of each repetition averaged across all 6. So that's what I mean by mean power here. Peak across a number of repetitions performed. And in the triceps, that was about double in males. In horizontal shoulder adduction, we're seeing about double in males. And then that's a unilateral press, plyometrics. It's a punch. It's draw back and slug. Oh man, guys, punch really hard. But over here, what we're seeing is females having, in the trunk rotation exercises, females just across the board were stronger than males. So you just get into this sort of split squat stance and do trunk rotations, and very consistently, females are stronger moving in both directions than males, one after the other. They're more strong. And so the trunk rotation is a fascinating one. Now, looking at bilateral imbalances, dominant versus non-dominant. Who cares if it's left or right? Dominant versus non-dominant. Some of these, internal rotation and external rotation at 0 degrees, we're seeing stronger in males and females in the non-dominant limb for internal and external rotation. But man, again, that punch, that unilateral press, plyometric, draw back and then slug, males and females, so much stronger in the dominant arm for that one. So looking at the unilateral punch, whether it's plyometric, just a straight, like no drawback, just slug forward, or using a barbell, two-handed. This one is the male and female. We're not there yet. This is male and female. Differences in mean acceleration, mean velocity, and mean power. And again, this is an unbalanced sample where it's mostly males. It did meet Levine's test of equality of variances, very much for each of these comparisons. But females, there was a pattern, again, only 19 of them, but there's a pattern for increased mean power in that punch. But when we're looking at a lot of these, they have not been measured in a way that would transfer to sport performance. And so it's opening up opportunities to look at what the weight room or the training environment, how that transfers onto performance. And so I'll be continuing to answer these questions at the national conference, but I'm happy to take, if there's time for questions. 1 minute, I've been told. I'm sorry, 1 minute for one fast question. The questions are not coming fast.
I'll entertain you here. Great presentation. Your information about the different athlete characteristics that may play out. Some of that stuff sounds like the old Russian and Chinese weightlifting coaches and track coaches looking at different loads and intensities that are capable of female male athlete programming. Is that some of the stuff that you're teasing out hear what might be unique about those athletes, allowing them to have those different profiles.
Yeah, great. So I'm sort of unfamiliar with the foundation of where the question is coming from. The question itself, I can answer. So having an ice, a lot of this, we have a Cybex in the lab, in the room right next door to the Proteus, and it doesn't look anything like the isotonic. The isokinetic profiles and the isotonic just look nothing alike in athlete after athlete. We go through as many different motions as you can. With a Biodex or a Cybex, it's a little bit limited in what you can do, but you can do shoulder stuff, you can do leg stuff, and trying to, but on a sports field, there's nothing is isokinetic about a sports field, unless it's like world's strongest man and you're pushing a train, or I don't know. But what we're trying to do is figure out some of what has been researched in a number of cultures and capacities in a novel way that might have a little bit closer predictive capacity on the sports field, where, literally we take a baseball bat handle and connect it to the machine, and we just have people do a full, or a tennis racket, and have them just do a full swing, full power, go through it, and then let's analyze the acceleration in that. And we can put it at different load profiles. And one of the things we did, we looked at how people go through some swinging motions, and then look at their consistency and their endurance and their power, and they very pilot studies, but looking at batting performance at the plate, if their swing is consistent, if their swing has higher acceleration, things like that. It's a little bit harder to do some of that stuff in such a controlled way, in my perspective.
And the same Dr. Jensen for his